Good afternoon, and welcome to Understanding Racialized and Intergenerational Trauma, a conversation with Resmaa Menakem. Today's program is sponsored by the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, the Office of Alumni Relations, the National Center for Excellence in Women's Health, the Black Women's Health and Livelihood Initiative, and the Office of Diversity and Outreach. To get us started, please welcome Dr. Renee Navarro, UCSF Vice Chancellor of Diversity and Outreach.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for today's program. I'm Dr. Renee Navarro, and I serve as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Outreach at UCSF, where I'm also a professor of anesthesiology and perioperative care. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who called this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. Today, we will learn about racial and intergenerational trauma. Racial trauma, as I understand it, refers to the increased rates of trauma that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color experience as a result of being exposed to microaggressions, other forms of harassment, discrimination, and violence. And although similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure to race-based stressors. The murder of George Floyd placed a spotlight on the topic of racialized trauma and its impact on communities of color. In response, there have been calls for social justice, racial equity, and many have asked how to become allies for change. In a few moments, we will hear from New York Times bestselling author Resmaa Menakem about the effects of racialized and intergenerational trauma, about the importance of mental health and action steps we can engage in to facilitate the necessary changes, as well as community building. Ultimately, the intent is for today's conversation to help illuminate a path for healing. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce John McCoy, Director of the UCSF Alumni Relations, our host for today's program.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Navarro. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured guest, Resmaa Menakem, the New York Times bestselling author and trauma specialist. Resmaa has served as the Director of Counseling Services for the Tubman Family Alliance, as the Behavioral Health Director of African American Family Services in Minneapolis, as a Domestic Violence Counselor for the Wilder Foundation, as a certified military and family life consultant for the U.S. Armed Forces, and as a cultural somatics consultant for the Minneapolis Police Department. He currently teaches workshops on cultural somatics for audiences of African Americans, European Americans, and others. He is also a therapist in private practice. Welcome, Resmaa.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all today.
No problem. Thank you. And joining Resmaa in conversation, please welcome Dr. Lisa Fortuna. Dr. Fortuna is Professor and Vice Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and Chief of Psychiatry at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. Her clinical and research areas focus on post-traumatic stress, anxiety and minoritized stress, Latinx and adolescent mental health services, access and quality of care for traditionally underserved, including children, immigrants, and the refugee population. She practices mindfulness and has studied post-traumatic growth and recovery after disasters and with communities of colors. She also co-authored with Zeta Vallejo the book Mindfulness-Based CBT for Adolescent PTSD and Addictions. Welcome, Dr. Lisa Fortuna. And lastly, but not least, to moderate our conversation today, please welcome Dr. Eve Ekman. Dr. Ekman is a contemplative social scientist designing, delivering, and evaluating tools to support emotional wellness in the field of healthcare, well-being, and technology. She draws from interdisciplinary skills and first-person experiential knowledge from clinical social work, integrative medicine, and contemplative science and meditation. She is a lead teacher for cultivating emotional balance, is a well-being lead on the health team at Apple, and a senior fellow at the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. Welcome, Dr. Ekman.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. Really looking forward to a rich dialogue here today, and I'm so honored to be moderating this experience by asking some questions and fielding the responses from both Lisa and Resmaa. And I want to say that, there are going to be times in this dialogue where things will come up that are hard and challenging to hear. And we're so fortunate to be here with Resmaa, who has really shared a vision of when we are working with the challenging material of unresolved historical and ongoing trauma, that we can feel that and hold that in the body. So I just want to instruct all of our amazing audience who are joining us now and in the future to let the practice of listening be part of the transformation we are all here for. So I really want to start off here and give a moment, Resmaa, to talk about this book, My Grandmother's Hands, which maybe surprised you in how much appeal it had internationally and how many people seem to really resonate with a lot of the core themes. There's such an important part in this book in terms of creating language and framework for understanding. And I was hoping you could unpack a bit for us about what does it mean to have white body supremacy, and how does it get systematically and often unconsciously and unwittingly embedded in our American bodies, as you so beautifully describe?
Yeah. So one of the first things that I want to do is I always start with a definition and a rubric, because I think that's important. The thing that I'm trying to do is usher in something that currently doesn't exist, and I don't quite know what it is, right? And so I think it's important to start off with a definition. And the definition of white body supremacy is that the white body deems and has deemed itself the supreme standard by which all bodies' humanity shall be measured philosophically and structurally. Now, just want that to land just for a second. So I'm not just talking about white supremacy as something that we should know about, as a cognition, as an idea. I'm talking about how that what we're working with structurally is a system that is predicated on the white body deeming and deemed itself the standard of humanness. So when we talk about whiteness or white people or white bodies, we're not just talking about that in kind of like a euphemism. I'm talking about that there was that the idea of the white body being human, and everything and every other body in this kind of pigmentocracy, every other body is a deviant, not just from whiteness, but from the standard of humanness. And so all of my work is around the violence of that, right? The anguish of that, the weathering and the withering of being in the structure of that, the undercoupling for white bodies of understanding really the depth of the feralness when it comes to that. And so for me, I want to start with that framing first, because I don't want people to start, as they're hearing me and Sis begin to start talking, that they start to begin to think about this in the same ways, in a way of just cognition. Oh, I got some good little tidbits from Resmaa, and that idea is enough to combat the feralness of white body supremacy. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd love to follow up on that with, Lisa, your experience in terms of reading My Grandmother's Hands, and how it speaks to your own research, especially in historically underserved communities, and any personal reflections that may be captured in Resmaa's really intimate portrait of his own grandmother, right? So anything you'd like to share about your research, as well as being a granddaughter, being a parent, and what this book inspired in you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first off, the title attracted me to it immediately. Growing up with a very involved grandmother who I think was very influential in how I even think about my clinical work. And I talked to people about my grandmother having a third grade education, but being my model for a physician. And that was pretty much because she used herbology, she used massage, she used faith and healing practices, and was really the healer in our community for Latino and Black neighbors, right? Who would come over and really feel trusting of her. And so I think that opened up my sensibilities about my own self-care in being a woman of color, working with traumatized, trauma experiencing communities, and also walking in a predominantly white world, right? As a physician and academic, how to sort of be in tune with my body and to use those things that are self-care. And I think where that's opened me up in my research and clinical work as well, which I think is really important for all of us to consider, is how are we in connection, with our own trauma in our bodies, and how we experience that, which I think is what's brilliant about this book and what Resmaa presents to us. Because I think it's really the work that we have to do and be fully embodied in, to be able to work with others. And I get this tested out all the time when I'm working with young people, adolescents, in research and in my clinical work. I've come with a training, a CBT model, right? I've done research in cognitive behavioral therapy. And it became really quick that the youth were telling me, well, it cannot just be all in my head. When I'm experiencing discrimination, I get tense, I can't hold it. So we really worked around how they support and work with their bodies and be in tune so that they can have steps to keep themselves well and safe, and attune their ability to manage those things. And opening up the avenues to be able to bring in those issues of body and spirituality, even into the research and how we design this work, and how do we sort of support therapists in doing that work. So that's all been part of the research, because I think the community and our patients will tell us that. If we
Eve, can I say something to what Sister Lisa just said?
Please.
So I love how she started off talking about how her training and her expertise is in a certain way, CBT and in working with adolescents and working with bodies of culture that have and continue to experience the feralness of this structure. The beautiful thing that I love about what she said is she said, and a shaping quality of that was my grandmother, right? My grandmother helped shape how I moved, what I vibed into, what the rhythm was, what the images, what the texture is, what the meaning making, the shifts in meaning, what the affect is, and the emotional, like what my grandmother did, and my grandmother did the same thing, was help to shape my understanding of how I move through time and space. And so for me, that what really helps our communities that come to us for help, what really helps them is, do they get a sense of that we are being with them, that we are present. And I don't mean present like everybody's talking about presence and trauma and all of these everybody's talking about that, but the rhythm and the experience of presence can't be faked. It has to be authentic. And many times bodies of culture are moving in and around structures that are inauthentic. And what I love about what Sister Lisa just said is, she said that one of the pieces is my training, but the other piece is how I be with these with these adolescents, and how I be with these adolescents allows for me to both have so one of the things I say about somatic abolitionism is that as you begin to work with the energies of somatic abolitionism, there are three requirements. The first one is that you develop a thickened skin, because if you're going to do any work that goes against what the structure says you should be doing, you better have a thickened skin. You better have a fortified mindset. And in that, you better develop a malleable heart at the same time. And so often what happens when we're working with these structures is that we develop a thick skin, a fortified mindset, and a hardened heart. And what I love about what Lisa said is that her grandmother and others nurtured her enough to where she could keep some of that malleability. So when the people that were in front of her were saying, no, there's something else here, she could hear it from the heart and not just from what was trained and put into her.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for lifting that up for us. And you brought up two other really important terms. I just want to make sure our listeners are catching on to: the bodies of culture, and also somatic abolitionism. And if you wouldn't mind, just a beat on those two, so that we make sure folks are really tracking with us.
So I as a part of the languaging that is emerging from the work that I'm doing, I don't use people of color anymore, because people of color, that term is really a term that really is about a color, but not color in a way that has any cosmological depth to it, or any type of philosophical depth to it, right? That it was only in juxtaposition to white, that color, that this idea was coming out. And so that's why I always say that tacit, faint voice up underneath when we're talking about some of these terms is always a centering of whiteness as the standard, and everything else is a deviant from the standard. So I say bodies of culture, because bodies of culture for me is about reclaiming that which was tried to be stripped from us, right? One of the first collective announcements that you are a person is that you are steeped in culture, right? And so those are the pieces, the language, the ways I move through time and space. Those pieces are the first things to be stripped from you and replaced with urgency, placed with productivity. And so that's why I don't use the term people of color. I say bodies of culture, because I really want people to situate this in the body. Somatic abolitionism is my expression. It's not something I created. It's what's been, it's kind of weaving together for me in terms of my understanding for how white body supremacy has ravaged bodies of culture, right? How it has made, how it has stripped collectively white bodies' understanding of humanness. And so there's for me, there's a reclaiming that bodies of culture have to begin to do in this structure. And there is a rehumanization that white bodies have to do in this structure. So somatic abolitionism is my container for how to hold these reactions and see what emerges as we hold these energies, this 400 and 500 year energy around this thing that we call race.
Thank you. Yeah. The language is so important, and then the instruction over and over to bring it back to the body. And so that's just what I'm continuing to learn from you. For our next question, I'd really like us to take on something that is a big challenge, not only now and historically, both in health and mental health research. Really, we rely upon a feeling of trust between institutions and the providers who work there with the communities being served. And we may possibly in this country and maybe globally be at an all-time low of trust from the general public, and especially bodies of culture, towards healthcare providers and scientists. And this mistrust is not new, and it's not unfounded. So how do we understand the historical implications, and what can we do to work with this? And Lisa, I'd love to start with you on this question of How have you had experience with this, working with it, of course, in your research and as a clinician?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you said, it's really important to understand that mistrust of the system, right, of services that we offer. You know, it has truth behind it, right, in terms of why people have been, you know, don't trust because they have been harmed. And I would say it's not just historical. I mean, it's historical. The historical pieces are critical because they continue to live within communities, and there's an awareness out of survival to avoid things that are harmful, right? So that trust has reason, right? And it's reasonable, right? And the other piece is that we really have to focus on how we provide or offer or invite people into opportunities for healing, and if we're going to call them services, that really has this historical trauma, racialized trauma in mind as our framework, and not just something that's put on a history book, right? But that it actually has a really palpable piece of how we engage with communities. You know, communities will, you know, I always find even in our research that folks will read a situation very quickly when they come into a system of care, and immediately check out where's the danger, you know, where's the threat, where's the harm. And sometimes the threat could be very pronounced, you know, in terms of I'm not going to get the right care. I'm going to lose my child to foster care, you know, all of these things that are really, you know, felt in the body. And I think people track it even before we talk, right? They see what is going on in the particular social situation. I think where it's worked for me in trying to overcome that is keeping that in my mind, that even, you know, as a Latina, you know, it does not mean that I don't represent that system as well. And so I have to come at it with sort of that invitation, I think that Resmaa was talking about, that being and openness to how people define their healing, their trauma. I always talk about it, and I talk about it in my book, it's not about fixing people or having the prescription, but serving the people that we encounter, and serving with the understanding that they do have what they need to heal. And I'm just serving that process with them. So I do go out into the community and ask them, you know, what are the healing practices that you do? And they're often a lot of the things that Resmaa talks about in terms of movement, spirituality, culture, the Latino community around San Francisco General that talks about la cultura cura, the culture heals, right? Sort of, you know, moving into those depths of what people know are healing. And it often is in the body and in spirituality and in culture and connection. And then you can bridge other things when people need what we call psychiatry or anything else, right? You can bridge that, but you have to start with an awareness of where people start.
Thank you. Yeah, Resmaa, I'd love to hear your reflections and thoughts on this topic as well.
Yeah, you know, Sister Lisa said something a few moments ago or earlier about when she's working with clients that sometimes the clients will say back to her, you know, all of this stuff ain't just in my head. And I think one of the most healing things that we can do, especially with bodies of culture, is to say, you're not crazy. That what you're vibing is real. I think we have this structural gaslighting kind of reflex that we do to bodies of culture. You know, when we're reacting to things that to other people seem very minor, but to us seems like we could possibly be annihilated, right? That we have a tendency to put that inside of the people as being some defect in them or in their culture. You know, one of the things that I say is that trauma in a person over time, decontextualized, can look like personality. trauma decontextualized in a family trait over time can look like in a family can look like family traits, and trauma in a people over time can look like culture. And so for me, when I'm working with people, I'm always looking at, how the historical, the intergenerational, the persistent, I say that bodies of culture and Black bodies specifically do not deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. We deal with pervasive and persistent traumatic stress disorder. A constant denial that anything has even happened, and that we should be concerned about. And so for me, this idea of cultivation and helping to cultivate those pieces of joy that are and resource that are in us, not just responding to the threat and the trauma, but also responding to when the joy pops up, so people can begin to kind of footnote that, oh, yes, all of this stuff is happening, and there are times when I am relatively safe in my home, or relatively safe in my car, or relatively safe. There are times where I can actually cultivate the sense of joy. So this system doesn't weather me and wither me in quite the same ways. And so when I'm listening to Sister Lisa, one of the things that I think about is, right now, yesterday we just started the trial for Potter, a police officer up here in Minneapolis, who shot and murdered a young black male, Dante Wright. And I think about the communal anguish of now, not just going through the Kyle Rittenhour, not just going through what happened, the Charlottesville, not just going through the Ahmaud Arbery, not just going through Breonna Taylor, but the consistent destruction of Black bodies, right? How do we begin to develop a way in our communities that can deal with not just the episodicness that we think it is, but the persistent and consistent destruction of Black and Indigenous bodies as a way of accentuating healing in these communities, and not just look for people, not just do quote unquote things with people or to people when they come into our office. How do we develop ways of being accountable to other bodies, so that when other bodies come into our offices, we already have cultivated a way of being that I don't have to necessarily get CEUs for. So,
Thank you. Yeah. And I think what I'm hearing from both of you is, and especially from Lisa, that mistrust is healthy. Mistrust is valid. It's important. It's not something that clinicians or scientists are trying to get rid of or avoid, or not a sign or signal of a problematic or difficult patient encounter. And I think that reframing is something probably we need to remember on a minute-to-minute basis. Yeah. So I'd love to shift a bit and talk actually a bit about healing, and especially, Resmaa, you've used the ancestral forms of healing, bodies of culture that help people reconnect to the body, and these are drawn from Indigenous faith traditions. And yeah, I was hoping to hear you describe a bit the role of faith traditions in the practice of healing racial trauma.
Yeah, this next thing I'm getting ready to say probably is going to piss some people off, but it is what it is. I think when we're trying to develop something that speaks to the 400 and 500 years of feralness and brutality as it relates to Black and Indigenous bodies, I think sometimes we forget that that we're going to have to create these pieces and not try and retrofit things into this. We have to nurture this thing so what needs to emerge can emerge. A lot of times what I see is that people try and retrofit the things that I'm talking about into a yoga practice, or they try and retrofit the things that I'm talking about into a religious practice, or try and retrofit it into something. And at the moment you do it, you truncate the possibilities, right? And because a lot of this stuff is structured around, even things like DEI work are structured around white comfort, right? Being able to say things so white people don't lose their minds, right? And so I think when I'm thinking about joy, I'm thinking about it as more of a spiral, right? That when I heal or involved in the healing process, it is a historical, intergenerational, institutional, and a personal experience. And so when I began to heal with those notions that my ancestors are bestowing on me, like my ancestors, when they're talking to me, they don't speak in English. They don't speak in Spanish. They don't speak in Portuguese. They don't speak in French. You know what I mean? They speak in vibes and vibrations. And I have to condition myself to be able to hear what it is to say. And that is a lifelong process of being able to hear when I can discern a shift in meaning, right? And this is not cognitive. This shows up in the body as vibes and vibrations. Our bodies are both receivers and amplifiers. And so for me, this idea of healing there is a conditioning that has to be done in order for us to even be able to hear the depth of what's being said. If we just think about it and try and retrofit it into another practice, it limits what we can hear, what we're actually able to. So for me, joy cultivation is really about being with other bodies, and I have a tendency to have bodies of culture with bodies of culture and white bodies with white bodies, because white bodies have this undercoupling that has to be worked with. That when you start slamming these bodies into a room together, number one, you're not equating for the charge, and number two, you're not equating for the escape hatches that are built into a white body supremacist structure. So for me, joy is one of those things that has to. I believe that trauma is not primary. Trauma is actually a protective, thwarting energy, just like what Einstein said, that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Trauma is an energy that thwarts and constricts, right? The reason why we must deal with trauma is that it thwarts and constricts what's generative and emergent, right? And so we must work with the energy of it, so what is already there that wants to emerge can begin to emerge. But if we don't work with the trauma and the decontextualization of it, it can't quite emerge in the ways that we need it to emerge. So joy is always there. Trauma is not primary. Joy, love is primary, but it is thwarted. It is constricted. I'm not even sure if that answered the question, but it was what came to me.
Thank you. And I want to, again, just like highlight and lift up something that you said might piss people off, but I think is really worth mentioning, which is we may not be able to make these practices evidence-based or manualized or, this kind of pearl of wisdom we love so much in teaching and education and in the medical setting. And that's a big freedom, actually. That's an invitation and an openness of how folks are going to learn to bring what's natural for them into the healing process. And so I really appreciate that openness.
So I'd really like to hear from Lisa, but when I talk about these structures, many of my people that look like me, in terms of pigmentation, people that look like me, have been brutalized by some of these practices, right? Over centuries, brutalized. The conquistadors they brutalized a people, right? Missionaries with all their niceness and kindness, brutalized a people and created a ground for land to be taken. And so, you know, these things, these notions around, well, let's just bring spirituality into it, or let's just bring that. To me, it has to be an emergent spirituality, not a coerced spirituality, right? So that's.
Thank you. Yeah, Lisa, I would love to hear, you know, either any response you'd like to what Resmaa is sharing with us and that richness. And yeah, if it feels also like maybe that piece around what do these faith traditions or spiritual experiences, how can they support the healing process given your own personal experience and work?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to underline what I think a lot of people might be experiencing and hearing this is that it's not this cognitive thing, right? It's not an intellectualized thing. And I know a lot of people are asking questions like, you know, how do I, you know, tell me the thing, right, that I need to do to make this right. And I'm appreciative of the desire, because that's the first step. But I think it's, you know, even as Resmaa's speaking, you know, I'm of a practice of even sort of just like how, even through the Zoom, how I'm feeling and resonating with what he's saying. And I actually experience it in vibration. And it's a very, you know, it's a very interesting thing for me as he's talking of like it's vibing with me, right? And I think that that whole idea of being, right?
Yeah.
So you know, I'm a Episcopal priest, okay? So, but I never talk about doctrine or ask very specific questions around Christianity or even in the mindfulness, right? Even if we do practice, I try to sort of see how that connects with the person's practice or not, right? And how do we work with that? I worked with Muslim communities, right? And never spoke a word about Islam or Christianity. And they've asked me, oh, I think you're a woman of the good book, because it's just, I just feel it. And what is it? It's just basically that openness to being with people and that emergence of what is the spirituality, right? So I've had young people who, after a while, have said, you know, I want to talk to you about this vision that I have of someone that's passed, that's coming to me to talk with me, and making something better around my trauma, right? And this was a young woman who was very stuck with her depression, and once we started to explore what was emerging in these conversations that and first she said, you're gonna think I'm crazy, and I'm like, right. No, I do not. And so then she started telling me about this vision and the conversation and the healing that she had to do with this person who had passed, come before her, was very critical. And I saw that then her depression started to elevate in my measures of depression, right? But I think it was that openness in the space that we can sort of bring to people that again, it comes from this not fixing, but serving the emergence of those things. And then I do talk to people about where do they find that in like their faith community, because there's a lot that can happen in faith communities. There's transcendent, there's ritual, there's physicality, there's community. That's where sort of, you know, bodies connect, right? And sort of deal with healing. Scripture is a whole long trauma story about how people overcame and persisted despite enslavement and everything else, right? In the Hebrew Bible. So we work with all of those things, but we let it emerge from what's resonating with people, where they've been conditioned, and how do I serve that?
Yeah. I would also like to say that when I'm listening to Sister Lisa, one of the things that's coming up is people may hear that and they may hear, oh, I can do that. What she's saying, I can do, right? And what I want you to do is just hold that for a moment. Just like there is such a sense of urgency. I believe that one of the primary linchpins of white body supremacy is urgency. like even when you just heard me pause, just notice how you wanted me to get to the next piece, right? Rather than just holding that. That is a conditioning, that is a tempering, that is a rep, as I always say. Being able to sit with the things that are disparate, right? And allow things to emerge and begin to be able to see the things that emerge as not as good or bad or evil or stuff like that, but as things to be curious about. Things I always talk about, this idea of whenever people come and see me when I'm doing workshops and stuff like that, they always ask me, well, Resmaa, give me the top 4 tools that I could use to work with people. And one of the things that I'll caution people about, and this is from Sister Nieto, Leticia Nieto, she talks about, we need to stop thinking about this as toolboxes and start thinking about this more as toy boxes. And just notice when you heard me say toy box, just notice, like, was there, like, there is a certain piece of resonance that when you say toolbox, it suggests that there is a right tool to fix this problem, as opposed to toy box when you say, how do I explore into these things? How do I be playful? How do I see if this Barbie doll fits into this square hole? And how do I, right, like how do I begin to cultivate the idea of toys as opposed to tools? And so when I'm listening to Sister Lisa, I'm hearing this piece around, she had to go through some things before she was able to be with people this way. This is not something that you don't learn how to do this in your practicum. You don't learn how to do this, when you're doing your rounds. This is something that you have to pay attention to and watch the emergence in yourself. So when it happens in other people and you start to recognize it, you actually see it as data points. You actually see it as something that's useful, as opposed to something that is not useful and peripheral. So.
I was practicing making a pause there, Resmaa. Thank you. Yeah, so rich. I'd love to get one of the wonderful questions our audience submitted ahead of time. And before I do so, just to say that, in your book, you really highlight that we're going to want to create change immediately. We really want people to be able to, we want to use these practices, and you encourage folks to just read the whole book and do every practice.
Yep.
And happily, the workbook now is out, so folks can really work through it together. Yeah. And so again, kind of highlighting this idea of, it's not don't do anything, right? Working with the urgency and working deliberately to see what comes up instead of forcing it. So yeah, thank you for that again.
That's it.
So one of the questions that came up was really around just our very first question, kind of connecting to grandmother and ancestor. And the question is, when we don't know what grandmother's hands were like, how can we connect with our ancestors? I don't know if either one of you would like to venture into that.
Sister Lisa, you want to go first, or?
You go ahead.
So this is one of the things that I think that people, when we talk about ancestors, is that they assume that there is some human face that we need to attribute to, so this was my great grandmother, or Dr. Martin Luther King keeps showing up. Like, I mean, that's what people think, that we're looking for a specific piece. And one of the things that I think, or I believe, is that, this is energy, right? And that we are energy having a human experience. And that when I'm talking about ancestors, I am talking about creation itself. We are not apart from creation. We are part of creation. Some of our doctrines would have us to believe that we should be dominion over everything, and as opposed to in communion with everything. And part of our work, I believe, is really about beginning to what's the word? Just give me 1 second, y'all. Beginning to have a broader, there it is, a broader understanding of ancestorhood, right? Ancestorhood for me is both creation, elemental, rock, fire, water. I mean, it is ancestral. It is in communion with creation, not a part of creation, not some entity that bestows certain things on me and not other things on other people. And so for me, this idea of ancestorhood is really about moving things away that allow me, that force me away, that force me not to see myself in connection with creation itself. And so, and my ancestors are elemental, are ancestral in terms of, you know, some type of human, but in this essence they are energetic. And so it is, so my understanding is not just a person, although sometimes people show up, which is why the first practice in the book is about who showed up, right? That who showing up is not who as in personality, but who showed up as in vibes and vibrations, who showed up as in image, thought, experience, imaginations, right? Who showed up in terms of a shift in meaning, who shows up in terms of weight and texture. That's what I mean when I say ancestor.
Thank you. Lisa, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's once again kind of getting out of our head, right? You know, we like to think about what we could see and touch in certain ways, right?
Yeah.
And I think what this is really calling is to say that sort of awareness, right? And this is part of sort of being and not rushing it. You know, awareness to what you experience in your body. There was this one interesting exercise that I have to add that when I was in seminary, that kind of tapped me into this in an interesting way. And it was in my preaching course. And, you know, and sort of course I'm thinking and I'm like, let me put the words right and let me preach or whatever. And I had this voice instructor who taught preaching and voice. And she talked about tapping into your voice, which is more than just the physical parts, right? You know, she's saying even the way your mouth is formed and constructed and how your energy is comes from so many people before you.
Yes, yes.
In DNA, how your body is formed, how your mouth is formed, so that when you speak, you are actually speaking with the voice of the ancestors that came before you to create you in that voice.
Come on.
And that was a very deep experience for me in tapping into then what does come from that voice, which is more than here, but it is this other energetic experience that is embodied in me.
Yeah.
So it really embodies that ancestral voice for me. And so it's a whole other way of framing. How do we think about even what we speak and what emerges? Is that emergence? And being aware and being so that you're an instrument of that emergence. I guess
that's
that
it.
makes sense.
So Sister Lisa just said, so an instrument of that emergence, right? So one of my elders used to always say, in some ways it was an admonishment of me. He used to say, at some point you're going to learn to listen to the voice within the voice. At some point. Or not. right. And so what that spoke to me is that there is this sense of conditioning and tempering that many of us are not willing to do. Many of us are not willing to do that tempering, both individually and communally, do that tempering and conditioning. So what's being experienced and communicated, we can actually hear it, right? Without the bypassing, without the spiritual bypassing, without the sexual bypassing, without the yoga bypassing. I mean, we can yoga the hell out of anything, right? I mean, and so, but that doesn't stop the voice within the voice, right? That's a conditioning process. That's not a workshop. That is information and things that are given to you and bestowed upon you. And then over time, they create a glue and a tapestry. Many of us want to leapfrog over that. We want things on the front end that only can happen on the back end. So, yeah.
Wow, that was incredibly rich. I look forward to, experiencing my voice in that way. Lisa, thank you for offering that. It's really unique opportunity. So I think we have time for just one more of these questions. I will say many of the questions are, what can I do? How can I do it? So we covered that. Sit tight.
Yeah.
Sit
Pause.
tight.
Pause. Pause. The first thing is to pause. Because in the pausing, and Sister Lisa knows this, in the pausing, quaking begins to happen, right? And especially, to me, race has such a charge to it, 400- and 500-year-old unexplored charge to it, that when you pause, specifically in white bodies, when they pause, that quaking begins to reverberate. And most of the time, what we think is healing is to help people stop the quaking. Actually, that stops the healing. You have to condition a body to be able to hold and contend with that quaking. So what could emerge over time develops the capacity to emerge. If when the quaking happens, you're so quick to stop it and figure out ways to yoga the hell out of it, you're gonna eventually that energy. Remember, we talk about energy. That energy is going to keep building up behind the dam, right? So yeah.
And I again just want to lift up and highlight that point is, of course, there's nothing wrong with yoga. Yoga is wonderful, and yet if we're applying it to avoid feeling the necessary pain, and I'm going to go back on myself, and actually what I'd really love to hear, maybe as a way for us to kind of start winding down this wonderful conversation, is about clean pain and dirty pain. Resmaa, I just find that to be a conceptualization so profound and useful.
Right. So that came from two mentors of mine who both passed. One passed last year. One was Dr. David Snarsh, who wrote a book called Passionate Marriage and the Sex Crucible, and then Dr. James Maddock. Two reasons why I'm mentioning. The first reason is that they loved me and nurtured me through my development as a therapist, and the person who's also still living is Dr. Oliver Williams at the University of Minnesota. But we used to talk about clean and dirty all the time, not versus, not clean or not clean versus dirty, but clean and dirty, and because both are important elements to our development, right? And that dirty is that experience, like when we talk about racialization, white body supremacy, dirty is that experience that, particularly white bodies have, where they know that what is happening and what they're experiencing in the anguish, they know that it is that in order for it to change, that they're going to have to do something. And dirty is deciding not to do anything. And that resonance that you experience with that. And either by omission or commission, you become complicit with a white body supremacist system. Clean is when you begin to do something, and that's painful too, right? Clean pain has the ability to build capacity in ways that dirty pain does not. Dirty pain gets you around what you should be going through, right? Dirty pain is not evil. Eventually, if you do it long enough, you begin to come up against yourself and you say, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I ain't doing that no more, right? I don't know what the next, and now all of a sudden you find yourself moving into clean, not pain. As adults, we know, I mean, how many of us have been in relationships with people and we know, I probably should not be in a relationship with this person. I mean, if I look at everything that but you can't extricate yourself from it, right? That's dirty. You know it's dirty and you can't. Clean is when you get to that place and you go, yeah, this is going to suck really bad, and I got to go. I can't do this, right? And as adults, we don't get a choice between clean. And when it comes to racism, white bodies have built-in escape hatches, right? And so there is less consequences for doing nothing as opposed to doing something. Just ask the people that Kyle Rittenhour shot, the white bodies that Kyle Rittenhour shot, right? There is consequences towards confronting racism and moving out on wanting justice for a Black body, right? There's consequences. And that's exactly why most white bodies don't engage, because they know the consequences could be death and murder and feralness and lack of access. And so they would rather be complicit than to actually develop a culture that can actually hold their transformation. So that's clean and dirty.
Thank you. Yeah, and Lisa, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us maybe a little bit of how you see, especially some of the themes and topics here weaving into your work and then the greater work of UCSF to be with and move towards the clean pain.
Yeah, I mean, I think Resmaa's bringing it that it's not going to be by workaround, right? Because there is a threat, right, to sort of doing this work. And if it's not something that seems as dangerous as being shot for standing up for Black bodies, it could be a sense of loss or change, right? That seems that people may be wary of what seems to be a stripping of privilege, or that, and that's the challenge. And to do that as a system, it's not overnight. Like, this is what we've been saying. It's not, we're going to have the 20 points and we're going to work through them. It's really around working through the process. I had this fantasy of everyone listening, to actually work through his book, because, I gained a lot from it. I listened.
Thank you for that, sis. Thank you for that, by the way.
And I listened when you said, do not skip over this, because you can sort of skip over. And there were some exercises that were painful and challenging, but necessary. And I think if we could walk through that, if everyone walked through that, it might build the scaffolding of how do we
That's it.
In this way. And it's the being, it's the way, right? That'll get us there more than the facts per se.
Scaffolding. Building a scaffolding, building a container that can actually hold this charge. Many times when we start to begin to do this work, we just go, okay, let's just talk about implicit bias. Let's come in and do EDI work. And what ends up happening is that you quickly realize that you don't have the scaffolding that is tempered enough to be able to withstand that charge, right? And so beautiful. Yeah, the idea of creating a scaffolding, a container that can actually contain and hold the charge of race, as opposed to assuming that people should already have that scaffolding. We do not have the scaffolding. So, yeah.
Thank you both so much. I really feel so enriched by this conversation, as I'm sure our viewers now and in the future will. And I want to invite John to come back and help us wrap up towards the end here.
Yeah, thank you all for a fabulous conversation. The comments are amazing and it's been quite helpful to the audience. I wanted to remind everyone that if you did sign up for the after the talk processing session, I placed the link for that in the chat box. I'll send it out one more time in the chat box. Go ahead and copy and paste that link into your web internet browser. You should be able to access the session. And then finally, thank you to our panelists and our guests, Resmaa Menakem, thank you so much for making the time. Dr. Lisa Fortuna, thank you so much for adding to the conversation. And Dr. Eve Ekman, thank you for moderating. It's been a pleasure having you all be part of this. Also want to thank Dr. Alyssa Eppel for helping to coordinate this and connect all of the UCSF community and beyond. And of course, Dr. Renee Navarro also for coming on board. Everyone have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.